For Chapter 11 in the American Government class, let's talk about political parties. These were organizations that were not originally considered a part of the U.S. system. Madison actually considered political parties as just another faction to have to deal with, but they evolved fairly quickly into an integral part of our democratic system. Let's review just a little bit about the differences in the U.S. two-party system. We'll talk a little bit more about how the two-party system evolved, but we have the Republican or the conservative-leaning party that generally advocates for less government intervention, looking at more traditional social family values, potentially a little bit more religious-leaning values, and leaning more towards pro-business, pro-corporate interests, pro-small business interests. The Democratic or liberal-leaning party, a little bit more towards a proactive government to try to address issues perhaps earlier than the conservative side would want, by being more liberal, generally more acceptable to the changing values, shifting norms that occur in a society, typically leaning more towards pro-workers' rights, pro-labor, things like that. What do the parties do? They are the office seekers in our political system. The goal, and we've discussed this before, primary goal is to win control of the government and influence policy that the people in your ideological group are going to want to pursue. So that provides a vehicle, an avenue for people to come together that have similar beliefs, similar ideological goals, and that if they get control of the government, they can influence policy. They also recruit and nominate candidates through local organizations, through local, state, national conventions, and then through primary elections, as far as trying to determine who the candidate will be for the general election. Party is an organization that bears the cost of bringing fairly disparate constituencies together into a coherent coalition. The two major parties are trying to maximize as many people as they can get, and so therefore they could obtain a majority in order to win an election and then to get control of a legislative chamber. So got to bring those people together, bear the costs of that. They also aggregate preferences into a platform, what you might could call a prepackaged ideology that makes it simpler for constituents to say, well, that party's got my back, or that's what I generally believed in. So rather than having to get too much more involved in figuring out what the issues are or what the details are, can vote for that party. In addition, the party is responsible for getting out the vote. Now, we can clearly see that parties are not interested in increasing the entire voter turnout. They are focused, this is rational behavior, they are focused on maximizing their party. The people that are adhering to their ideology, that's who they want to maximize, and are actively involved in trying to suppress the other party's voters from voting, because we have a system where we have two major parties and one of them desperately wants to win control of government. So that's kind of how it would work. At the local level, as far as Republican and Democrat grassroots types organization, Bergen County Republican Organization, that's the website, Democratic Committee of Bergen County, to where anyone could get involved at the local level, perhaps even volunteering to help on the behalf of those parties' candidates, maybe even contributing into the formulation of local platforms, which would then get translated or transferred on up into potentially part of the national platform. The U.S. two-party system came about fairly quickly we've talked about some of these earlier events before, whereas by the time George Washington stepped down, we had two pretty clear factions: the Hamiltonians that were more of the Federalist side versus the Jeffersonians that were more of what we would call the Democratic Republican side. Then by 1804, with Jefferson in office, the Federalist Party eventually started to fade away, and that's why between 1804 and 1824, that's called the Era of Good Feelings, because Jefferson's party, the Democratic Republicans, virtually dominated. And in 1820, James Monroe actually ran unopposed. There was no other candidate running against him. That would be, of course, unheard of in today's world. In the 1824 election, it was very close, and it went into the House. Andrew Jackson had the lead in both the popular vote and the electoral vote. It went into the House. The Speaker of the House was Henry Clay, who did not like Andrew Jackson. And in the very first vote, the presidency went to John Quincy Adams. And then not long after that, John Quincy Adams appointed Henry Clay as Secretary of State. This is all fairly expected and not surprising that this stuff would happen. But there was even evidence that Jackson himself had talked about perhaps offering Clay something as well. Nevertheless, Jackson felt like he had been denied by some corrupt bargain and went on the warpath, literally. He resigned from the Senate and formed what is now known as the Democratic Party. He won the election in 1828. Democratic Party was formed at that time. Unfortunately, as we moved towards the Civil War, the Democrats, particularly in the South, were the party that advocated for slavery. By 1856, the Republicans had coalesced from several parties, including remaining Federalist and the Whig Party, with Abraham Lincoln, their candidate. They won office during the Civil War and pretty much dominated politics for the most part after the Civil War until the Depression. There was a few Democratic presidents, but the Republicans did fairly much dominate until the Depression. And then we see that because of the Depression, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal policies that had shown some success when he was governor of New York, he was elected president, and we're using the New Deal policies, which called for more government intervention in order to try to alleviate the economic problems, combat the Depression. And then we had a flip-flop. So the Democrats pretty much dominated politics in both houses up through the 1960s. By the 1980s, we had another backlash to where, with all the financial problems of the 1970s, the scandals, the oil shocks, things that were going on, there was another turnaround where the Republican Party under Ronald Reagan was elected under the agenda that government was too much involved and the government was the problem. So we started to flip-flop again towards principles of advocating for the business interests and neoliberalism, which is more of a global economic pursuits. These began to dominate, and you could perhaps argue that these principles generally, we've had some hiccups mainly with the war on terror that diverted some attention, and of course the Great Recession of 2008, which also shifted gears quite a bit into government trying to alleviate the problems of the economy. But generally, business interests and global capitalist interests still pretty dominant. Since 1968, we've had a divided government. 38 out of the 52 years since then. Divided government simply means that you have one party that controls the presidency and then another party that controls one or both of the houses of Congress. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because if you have a divided government, then you might get more deliberation, more opportunity for compromise, trying to find that middle ground in order to get the best policy. However, our two-party politics have become even more polarized since then, so with each divided government, that has seemed to have exacerbated the problem more than facilitated any compromise. So that's kind of where we are now with a very polarized, highly partisan system, particularly in our federal Congress, that makes them less effective than they used to be, not near as productive as they used to be, and unable to address many issues that certainly could use addressing. Why do we have this two-party system? The main reasons are embedded structurally into the Constitution. These are what we call the institutional reasons. There's nothing in the Constitution that says anything about having to have two parties. As I said before, Madison, who was the chief architect of the Constitution, felt that parties were part of the problem, the faction problem that we needed to diffuse. He had to change his mind on that fairly quickly with the formation of the parties that happened almost as soon as Washington stepped down. But in the Constitution, we do have the single-member district plurality, which means that there is one representative that's elected from each district. And over time, that has quickly shown to be conducive to just two candidates because there's no second or third member from that district that would, you could say, motivate additional parties to come into the race. For example, if you have a multi-member district where you are electing 3 representatives from that district, well, after the first 2 representatives get elected, there's still that third representative that needs to get elected, so therefore 2 more parties, or at least a 4th party, would be motivated to stick around to try to get that third place. The same logic would apply if you had 7 members elected from that district. You would effectively have at least 8 parties that would try to win those 7 spots. So therefore, if you only have 1 representative coming from the district, you only have motivation for 2 parties to try to get that. There's no motivation for any additional parties because there's no other members coming from that district except for that 1 representative. So that has become one of the most predominant structural reasons as to why we have only 2 major parties. The second reason is also structurally embedded in our Constitution, and that's the Electoral College. The Electoral College, even with the 12th Amendment, which we talked about when the election of 1800 was so messy, after the 12th Amendment, they still kept the majority requirement. Today we have 538 electoral votes, and you must win at least 270 in order to win the presidency. So therefore, if somebody has to win the majority, if a third or fourth party candidate is thrown into that mix and they have some amount of popularity, well, the chances of no one winning the majority is much more likely. So they figured out fairly quickly, if we want to have someone to be able to win the majority of the Electoral College, we only need 2 viable candidates to try to get that. A third party could actually throw it into the House every single election. So therefore, there's no incentive for third parties to get in there and mess up that majority requirement in the Electoral College. This was not what they intended. This is just how it evolved over time. One of those things that the framers of the Constitution could not perhaps foresee. So those are the 2 major structural institutional reasons as to why the United States evolved very quickly into the 2-party system that we have. There are the 12 congressional districts in the state of New Jersey. There is 1 representative that goes to the House of Representatives elected from each one of these districts. Some more things that have contributed to the maintenance of the 2-party systems and why it seems to get even more embedded culturally. The winner-take-all electoral votes, this is where the state's popular vote winner gets all of the electoral votes. So that makes it more motivating for a state to do that so that the candidates will pay more attention to that state. And it also is one of the reasons why a presidential candidate can win a pretty substantial majority of the electoral vote, but yet have fewer popular votes. That's happened a few times. Gerrymandering, we've talked about that before, where the states who are responsible for redrawing districts every 10 years, the party that's in power can try to ensure that they stay in power by redrawing the districts that will favor them. We talked about how that occurs, but that also contributes to just two parties. If one party can get back in control, then they can perhaps use some of these techniques to try to stay in power, and then it could potentially bounce back and forth between the two major parties. We also see that in America, we've been socialized into this system, and this either-or choice seems to be fairly preferable to a lot of humans, where I can just pick right, wrong, good, bad, up, down, left, right, in, out. That's kind of easier for humans, and that's what us humans tend to like to do, is make things easier on ourselves. So this dichotomous left or right, either or, Republican, Democratic choice has appeal, and if we tried to change from that, there would be quite a bit of opposition because it's come up before. It's also very difficult for third parties to gain traction. In many states, the third-party presidential candidate can't get many electoral votes because of the fact that if a third-party candidate is kind of scattered around the country, he may get a few votes in each state, but he can never get enough in any one state to win that state's electoral votes. Unless, and this is where it's happened before, Strom Thurmond, back in the 30s and 40s, thereabouts, he had a very strong presence in a few southern states. So he would actually win the popular vote in a few southern states. Therefore, he could gather some electoral votes. However, not near enough electoral votes to win the election. So unless those electoral votes are congregated in a state, they are not going to get any electoral votes. Third-party candidates are also on single issues or short-lived issues. There are some examples, and if there's any useful platform from those third-party candidates, well, then they can just get absorbed or usurped by one of the two major parties, which have the power to do that by already being there and in place and having a lot of momentum. Then they can pick and choose and perhaps take some of the power away from that third party. There's also ballot restrictions. In some cases, it's very difficult for a third party to get enough signatures on a petition just to get on the ballot. Ralph Nader, who is fairly regular third-party candidate, as recently as the 2008-2012 election, could not even get on the ballot on several states because could not raise enough signatures to do that. I've already talked about the entrenched power of the major parties, and they are constantly worried that a third party could siphon some of their votes, and that has happened before. In the 1992 election, Ross Perot was a candidate for the Reform Party, and Ross Perot took enough votes away from George H.W. Bush to assist in him losing. It wasn't the only reason, but assisted in the defeat of George H.W. Bush, who was running for re-election, and then that was when Bill Clinton was elected president. So because of this fear that a third party could come in and take away some of their votes, such as the Green Party taking away some of the votes of the Democratic Party, which was part of the equation in 2000 when Al Gore was defeated by George W. Bush. So therefore, the major parties, regardless of how much sympathy or even some shared ideology that they might have with a third party, are going to do what they can to try to keep that third party from gaining much traction. Another thing is that we have is that the swing voters are aware that if they vote for a third party, that they are wasting their vote. Now that's in quotations, doesn't mean that their vote is a waste. It means that they know that they're voting for a party that has no chance of winning. So what most swing voters do, realizing that they can actually determine the election, they will perhaps swing back and forth with each election depending on what the conditions are, and could literally decide the election by swinging their vote back over to the other party. So therefore, there's no incentive for them to vote for a third party as well. Talked about earlier how if there are useful pieces of a third party platform, they can get either absorbed or usurped by the major party, or the major party could just discredit them. An alternative to this is a proportional representation, which occurs in most parliamentary type systems around the world, such as in Europe. This is where multiple parties are represented in the legislative body, and they are roughly proportional to the strength out there into the electorate. So what happens here is that a country is divided into a smaller number of districts, and these are multi-member districts. So the districts are bigger. There's fewer districts and they're bigger. Argentina, for example, has 24 districts and 257 representatives. So that gives you an idea of approximately how many representatives are coming from each district. Countries like the Netherlands and Israel, the entire country is just one district. So all of the representatives are coming to their Congress at large from around the country. And so therefore, both of those countries have numerous political parties that are trying to get some form of representation in their Congress. And there may be a threshold. For example, you have to get at least, just for example, 5% of the vote in order to get at least some representation, maybe as low as 2%, in order to get represented in Congress. What happens here is that the parties provide a list of the candidates in order of their preference for each district. So what voters are voting on is a party. They're not necessarily voting for candidates. And if that party gets 40% of the vote, well then for that, we're looking at each district here, then they will get 40% of the seats from that district. For example, let's just assume that there's 10 seats that are being elected in each district. So what each party would do would provide a list of 10 candidates from their party in order of preference. So therefore, if the party gets 40% of the vote, it will get 4 out of those 10 seats that will be sitting in their Congress. And what will happen is, this is why it's order of preference, the first 4 names on that party's list will be the members that will go to that legislature. And typically, the person at the top of that list would be the candidate for prime minister. So the voters aren't necessarily voting for the prime minister, but they probably do have a very good idea that if that party wins the majority of that chamber, of that parliament, then that person will be prime minister. So there is obviously some names in mind, but they are technically voting for the party from these party lists. So that's how it works. Now, the United States does have a few examples of multi-member districts on the state level. There's about 10, 12 states in the United States that for their state legislative districts, they have multi-member districts. And one of those is New Jersey. New Jersey You have 2 General Assemblymen elected per district. We have 40 state legislative districts in New Jersey. So therefore, 1 senator is elected per district and 2 General Assemblymen, which is what New Jersey calls its House of Representatives. They call it the General Assembly. So 2 General Assemblymen are elected per district, so therefore there are 80 General Assemblymen in New Jersey's state General Assembly. So wrapping up, what are the pros of the two-party system? Well, it does simplify the electoral process, which human beings, and particularly people in the United States, have been socialized into this process. It simplifies it somewhat. It facilitates a clear either-or choice for voters, which does seem to matter to us, and it gives more meaning to your vote if you've got, let's just say, a 50-50 chance of voting for a candidate that's going to be the winner. So the simplification, the facilitating of the ease of choice, that sort of thing. When you look at the negatives of the two-party system, well, it could potentially be an oversimplification of politics, because if you only have 2 candidates or 2 party platforms, they could be missing a lot of things that we could be focusing on. So what you might see here is that the platforms are somewhat more watered down in order to accommodate subtle differences or nuances in policy, just so that they can get as many people into their party as possible in order to win that majority against the other party. And what we've seen, and it could be getting somewhat counterproductive today because of the partisan polarization, 2 competing factions with less common ground for compromise, wanting to win and then not necessarily working with the other party in order to pass policy. So it could be borderline dysfunctional. That's why it might be worth taking a look at if this polarization continues to worsen. So that's the chapter on parties, evolution of the two-party system, why we have a two-party system.